Chapter 1398. In fact, he had heard that Qin Anlin was going to marry Yi Liangqiu. Mr. Du admired Yi Liangqiu very much. From the bottom of his heart, he felt that it was a pity that Yi Liangqiu was with Anlin. After all, he knew about Anlin's love history. Mr. Du smiled. I can't touch alcohol, but I can touch women, right? Then, he looked at Kaim. As long as Kaim doesn't say anything, Miss Yi won't know, right? Kaim smiled bitterly and looked at Qin Anlin. Of course she won't say anything. Mr. Du raised his hand. The door of the private room opened, and a beautiful girl walked in. She was in her early 20s, and her temperament was similar to that of Yi Liangqiu when she was young. Anlin, this is to make up for your past regrets, Mr. Du hinted. Don't worry, there won't be any trouble. He raised his eyes again and looked at the girl who had just entered. He used his gaze to indicate for her to sit next to Qin Anlin. Qin Anlin just looked at her and didn't say anything. President Qin, my name is Xia Mian. The girl's voice was soft and very pleasant to the ears. Mr. Du looked at Qin Anlin. She hasn't graduated from the Chinese Academy of Drama yet. Qin Anlin knew what he meant. She was probably someone Mr. Du found. He smiled faintly. Let's have dinner together. Forget about the rest. Mr. Du was stunned for a moment. Why, are you not satisfied? Qin Anlin smiled. Of course, Mr. Du's arrangement won't go wrong. But I want to get married. Please forgive me. Mr. Du was stunned for a moment and then laughed. He sighed in a low voice. President Qin has changed. His temperament has changed. Next time, you have to bring your sister-in-law here for me to see. Qin Anlin just smiled and didn't say anything. The dinner continued. Xia Mian leaned against Qin Anlin. Her soft and young body leaned against Qin Anlin. The fragrance of a young girl floated into his nose. Qin Anlin quietly frowned and excused himself to go to the washroom. He slowly washed his hands clean, his expression somewhat solemn. Mr. Du's action was obviously a test of his loyalty to Liangqiu. He raised his eyes and looked at himself in the mirror. There was a dark look in his eyes. He didn't like people probing him, especially when it was related to Liangqiu. When he returned to the private room, he raised his phone and said, My wife is checking on me. Mr. Du smiled. I understand. Qin Anlin sat for a while and then left with Kaim. Before they left, Mr. Du asked them to send Xia Mian off. Qin Anlin glanced at it and nodded. Kaim didn't want to sit in the back, so he gave the back seat to Xia Mian. It could be seen that the little girl was still very restrained. Her hands were placed on her knees without moving. Kaim smiled and told the driver to drive. Where are you staying? Qin Anlin closed his eyes and suddenly asked. The young girl was wearing an ink-colored dress. Her skin was fair, and she seemed to be scared. She tilted her head and looked at Qin Anlin. Her voice was very soft. President Qin, you're asking me. Qin Anlin didn't say anything. Kaim understood and immediately said, Yes, Miss Xia. We'll send you back first and then go back to the hotel. Xia Mian pursed her lips. I'm staying at the Royal Hotel. I'll go back to Bi City tomorrow. Kaim turned his head and looked at President Qin. Qin Anlin only raised his eyes and snorted. What a busybody. Kaim smiled. Then you can stay in the same hotel. It'll save you the trouble. Xia Mian bit her lips. Thank you. Kaim thought that Mr. Du was really generous. He didn't even keep such a top-quality girl for himself. Chapter 1399. The car drove steadily, and the small space was filled with the faint smell of perfume. But more than that, it was the body fragrance of a girl. It was a very pure smell. Even a person like Kime couldn't help but feel his heart flutter. He sat up straighter and looked at President Chin in the rearview mirror from time to time. President Chin was still calmly resting in the back seat with his eyes closed. Kime admired Yi Liangqiu more and more. President Chin was like Liu Xiaohui when he was outside. Half an hour later, the black Rolls-Royce Phantom stopped in front of the Hong Kong Royal Hotel. Kime got out of the car first and opened the door for Qin Anlin. Out of politeness, he also opened the door for Xia Mian. Xia Mian stood under the neon lights, lowered her eyes, and then looked up again. Her long eyelashes fluttered, and it was a little breathtaking. "Thank you, President Chin." She smiled at Kime. "And thank you." Kime thought to himself, wow, she's a sensible girl. Fortunately, President Chin isn't tempted, or else he'll be pestered by her. Qin Anlin had been calm the whole time. He nodded and walked towards the hotel lobby. Kime hurriedly followed and even waved at Xia Mian. Xia Mian stood where she was, pursed her lips, and slowly followed. The elevator mercilessly closed in front of her. She looked at the exclusive elevator that went straight to the presidential suite on the top floor. This was the hierarchy. It was like this elevator, and she would never be able to enter it. Kime stood in the elevator and looked at Qin Anlin. After a long time, he said softly, "Do you think Mr. Du is trustworthy, President Chin?" "Half." Qin Anlin put his hand on his forehead and raised his face, looking a little tired. Kime couldn't help but lower his voice. "The private plane will fly directly to B City tomorrow morning. President Chin, you should rest first." Kime stayed in the second bedroom, and he went in first. Qin Anlin sat on the sofa for a while, then took out his phone and looked at it. There were no calls, no text messages, nothing. This heartless little thing. But even though he was angry, he still felt a little sweet. Qin Anlin sent a message over. "What are you doing?" There was a quick reply from the other side. "Help Muyun finish bathing." As long as Qin Anlin thought of her wet clothes, his heart would ripple. He didn't care that it was past 10 o'clock and called her. It rang a few times before he picked it up. Qin Anlin smiled faintly. "Liangqiu." Yi Liangqiu said vaguely, "I'm about to take a shower." "Not wearing clothes." He was immediately interested. Yi Liangqiu slid into the bathtub and sighed comfortably. At the same time, his Adam's apple rolled, and his voice was extremely hoarse. "Liangqiu." What's the matter?" She lifted her leg and gently splashed the water with her other hand. Qin Anlin listened to the sound of water and his body tensed up. "I miss you." "What do you miss?" Compared to his excitement, Yi Liangqiu was a little indifferent. But these 4 words made Qin Anlin excited, and he even began to speak incoherently. "I miss you everywhere, especially little Anlin." "Pervert." She snorted and told him about Mu Yun's situation today. He listened carefully without the slightest impatience, although he wanted to hear her say something nice. He loosened his tie and smiled lightly. "I'll talk to him when I come back." She was also silent for a while. In such a late night, they both tasted the taste of missing each other. Chapter 1400. Yi Liangqiu looked up and said softly, "Then stay in Hong Kong for a few more days." He chuckled. "Well, Mr. Du gave me a girl tonight." "Liangqiu, if I stay a few more days, I don't know if I can control myself." Yi Liangqiu sat up slowly and snorted. "It's okay if you don't want to control yourself. Are you angry?" His eyes were full of intoxicating smiles as he coaxed her patiently. Coaxing her like this made his heart soften. He wanted her to be angry. The angrier she was, the more she cared about him. When we go back, can you punish me? You can do whatever you want. Tie me up, beat me, whatever, he said shamelessly. His mind was also a little excited because of his excessive imagination. Yi Liangqiu couldn't stand him anymore. She was about to hang up when Qin Anlin said in a low voice, "Wait. The doorbell is ringing." She didn't hang up the phone when he said that. Her female intuition told her that something might have happened. For example, President Qin's love affair. Qin Anlin walked to the door with his phone in hand. He opened the door and saw Xia Mian wearing only a bathrobe. Her black hair was a little wet, and it was draped over her shoulders as if she was taking a bath. The translucent bathrobe was half hanging on her young body. It was midnight, and it was indescribably tempting. "President Qin, the shower in my room is broken. Can you take a look at it for me?" Xia Mian covered her breasts with her white fingers. Men always liked this kind of hesitation the most. Qin Anlin frowned slightly and said to Yi Liangqiu on the phone, "Wait." As he spoke, he opened the door wide and called for Kaim. Kaim walked out. At first, he looked at Xia Mian in surprise, but then he understood. "Go to Miss Xia's room and take a look." Qin Anlin's tone was a little indifferent. "Also, get another room. If Miss Xia needs anything, she can come to you directly." Kaim could hear the displeasure in his boss's voice. Xia Mian was obviously rejecting President Qin's offer, and he was chatting with his wife. Why did she have to butt in? Kaim nodded. "All right." He went back to the bedroom to get his things. Xia Mian's face was a little embarrassed. She pulled her clothes tighter and said, "Sorry for disturbing you." Qin Anlin was not polite to her. He said directly, "It's good that Miss Xia knows it." Xia Mian took a deep breath. "Let's not bother Kaim. I'll talk to the front desk." After that, Qin Anlin closed the door. "Did you hear that?" he said to the other side of the phone. "Mrs. Qin, I'm a good girl, aren't I? I didn't call anyone else." Yi Liangqiu snorted coldly. "President Qin, my shower is also broken. Can you come and take a look?" He chuckled. "Come back tomorrow morning, huh?" On the other side of the phone, he hung up. Qin Anlin looked at the phone and smiled. What a bad temper. But even so, he still liked it. Walking to the door of Kaim's bedroom, he said calmly, "Set the flight to 6 in the morning tomorrow." Kaim was a little surprised, but she still nodded. "I'll arrange it." Qin Anlin went back to his bedroom. He took a shower and lay on the bed for a while. He tossed and turned, but he couldn't fall asleep. After leaving Chocho, his insomnia came again. After a long time, he sat up and wanted to drink a glass of wine out of habit. But thinking of the child, he resisted the urge. Chapter 1401. She might have fallen asleep. It took her about half an hour to reply, and during this half an hour, he waited foolishly. "I'm asleep." These two words could melt his heart. He couldn't bear to let go of her. "Can you chat with me?" "Well, what gift did you bring me?" "Isn't myself the best gift?" After a long while, she replied with a few words. Shameless. Qin Anlin knew that she was extremely sleepy. His heart was sweet and sour at the same time. There was a woman knocking on his door just now, but she could actually sleep so peacefully. Did she trust him, or did she not care? Qin Anlin was furious, but that heartless little thing had already fallen asleep. He stayed by his phone for a long time, looking at it helplessly. But this kind of helplessness was sweet. He got up and went to the gym for 2 hours. At least he slept for 3 or 4 hours. He set off for the airport at dawn. Poor Kime, who was still asleep, dragged his luggage and followed his CEO. It was only 8:00 in the morning when they arrived in B City. Chin Anlin opened the door of the house. The house was still quiet. She probably hadn't woken up yet. He put down his luggage, walked into the bedroom, and watched her and little Mu-yun sleeping head to head. His heart softened. After watching for a long time, he took off his coat, untied his tie, and rolled it in his hand. He walked over lightly, gently carried her body, and walked straight out of the bedroom. Yi Liangqiu woke up. When she opened her eyes, she saw his slightly depressed face. She reached out and hugged him, still a little sleepy. "You're back so early." "Yeah." He rubbed the tip of his nose against hers. After a long while, he said softly, "I missed you." He carried her into the guest room and threw her on the bed not too gently. He knelt on one knee beside her, held her face with one hand, and kissed her. She finally woke up and looked up at him. "What's wrong with you?" Suddenly, her hand was tied by the tie and tied to the headboard. Chin Anlin. She was a little angry and glared at him. However, he comforted her and coaxed her softly. "Be good, don't move around." She kicked at him, but he quickly held her leg down and looked deep into her eyes. Yi Liangqiu bit her lip. "Weren't you satisfied last night?" He chuckled softly and tied her up tightly, then, he straightened his body and admired her struggling and helpless look. He reached out a hand and gently caressed her blushing face. "What should I use to satisfy you?" His slender fingers pinched her face, almost deforming it. Yi Liangqiu kicked him angrily and glared at him. She had never been in such a difficult situation. They were not even married yet, and he was already playing this kind of game. Seeing the look in her eyes, Chin Anlin chuckled and kissed her shamelessly. "I don't have those problems that you think I have. But Liangqiu, looking at you, I can't help but want to do this." "Excuses." She kicked him again and again, but her voice was soft. "You're obviously a pervert." "Yes, I'm a pervert." He lowered his head and kissed her. His slender hands held her hands to prevent her from hurting herself. They kissed like this for a long time. When he looked up at her, her eyes were filled with moisture and looked very tempting. "Did you miss me?" His fingers rubbed her delicate red lips, and his voice was extremely hoarse. Her long hair was scattered on the pillow. She looked at him hopelessly, and her lips were trembling slightly. "Baby, say you missed me." His heart was also a little excited, and there was a flame burning in his dark eyes, as if he wanted to eat her up. Oh. Chapter 1402. She looked at him with tears in her eyes. She looked like she was about to die. Chin Anlin lowered his head and kissed her earlobe. He said in a low voice, "Hurry up and say you missed me." Yi Liangqiu looked at him and said stubbornly, "I don't." She tried to kick him again, but he held her down firmly. His eyes were so bright that he looked as though he wanted to devour her whole. After a long while, he said in a hoarse voice, "How should I punish you for being so naughty?" After a long while, her pajamas were rolled up to her thighs, which was extremely seductive. Chin Anlin propped himself up and moved down slowly. She lay there in a pathetic state, watching him do whatever he wanted to her. The saying that absence makes the heart grow fonder was not wrong at all. Chin Anlin was more excited than ever before. He was even willing to die on top of her. When it was the hottest, he would let out a sexy moan. She closed her eyes and listened to him. She had never known that a man could make such a pleasant moan. The door opened quietly. Mu-yun, who was wearing a onesie, walked in quietly and climbed onto the bed. He hugged Chin Anlin's waist from behind. "Daddy." Chin Anlin's body froze. He was at a loss for words. He cursed under his breath and suppressed his burning desire. He covered Yi Liangqiu with the blanket and turned around to look at his son. In his heart, he wanted to cry. Did he still want a younger brother or sister? He exhaled deeply and calmed himself down. He forced a smile and said, Mu Yun is awake. Little Mu Yun looked at his father's face and felt that it was a little twisted. Did he disturb something? Yi Liangqiu was covered under the blanket. She could not move her hands and felt suffocated. She could only say weakly, Qin Anlin, let go of me. He glanced at her, then immediately untied her hands. Little Mu Yun looked at his father's tie and asked curiously, why did you tie mommy up? Yi Liangqiu was wrapped in the quilt, and her body was still trembling slightly. She stared at Qin Anlin and asked him to explain such a shameful thing. Qin Anlin tugged at the blanket. She was still wrapped tightly, not giving him a single piece of cloth to cover up his private parts. Yi Liangqiu. The father was annoyed and glared at her. The main reason was that he hadn't vented his anger yet, so he wasn't in a good mood. Yi Liangqiu ignored him, wrapped herself in the quilt and went back to the master bedroom, leaving him alone to face his precocious son and educate him about sex. Little Mu Yun's gaze was attracted by something, and he stared at it for a long time. Qin Anlin didn't know how to explain it to his son. He thought about it and coughed. Mom's back hurts. Dad is helping her loosen her muscles. Little Mu Yun looked somewhere else and asked slowly, do I need to take off my clothes? This, Qin Anlin touched his nose. It's not easy to massage with clothes on. How about I give you a massage too? Yi Mu Yun looked at him as if he was a pervert for a while, and then said with disgust, I don't want to. The excitement of looking at his father disappeared after looking at that horrible thing. Little Mu Yun left with little interest, leaving Qin Anlin, who came back from Hong Kong early in the morning. When everyone was gone, he looked down at himself. It seemed that he didn't want to do anything else during the day. He resigned himself to his fate and got up to take a shower. With a touch of dissatisfaction, he went to the kitchen. Yi Liangqiu was already cooking breakfast in the kitchen. Chapter 1403. Qin Anlin felt that his heart had been rekindled. He walked over and hugged her from behind. He rested his face on her shoulder and held her hand. What are you doing? Mu Yun likes to eat a kind of pancake these days. As soon as she finished speaking, she felt itchy on her neck. She turned her head and patted him. Behave yourself. Mu Yun will be here again in a while. His hand slid down her arm, acting a little unruly. I'm not doing anything. Why was he sticking so close to her? Yi Liangqiu glanced at him and continued to make breakfast. Qin Anlin had no choice but to give up. However, he felt sorry for her when he saw the faint bruises on her arm. Why did you hurt yourself? Yi Liangqiu turned her face and glanced at him. What do you think? He laughed again, a little complacent. With such a beautiful wife, what more could he ask for? He held her waist and whispered in her ear, I really want the shirt back. He rubbed against her and whispered, we can continue at night, or you can coax him to sleep at noon, okay? I won't coax him. Her voice was as sweet as honey, and his heart melted. He nibbled on her jade-like neck for a while before he chuckled again. Then I'll coax him. I've promised Mu Yun to take him out to play today. She turned her head and played with his good-looking chin with her fingers. Qin Anlin grabbed her hand and narrowed his eyes. You know that I'm coming back today, but you still took him out. What are you up to? She only smiled and didn't speak. Qin Anlin pinched her face. I'll teach you a lesson tonight. As soon as he finished speaking, he held her waist with one hand. The pancake is going to be burnt. She was brought into his arms, and he took over her work with alacrity. Just like that, they leaned on each other and made breakfast together. It felt very warm. Qin Anlin was a carnivore, but before he ate meat, he was willing to let his little animals out. Therefore, he accompanied the mother and son for the whole day. Unlike other children, little Mu Yun didn't like to go to the amusement park. He liked to go to the study room to read. Often, he could look at it for an entire morning. In the end, little Mu Yun was reading, his mother was looking at him, and his father was looking at his mother like a fool. The scene was very intoxicating. However, the peace of the family of three was soon disturbed. A gentle voice sounded, "President Qin." Qin Anlin looked up and saw that it was Xia Mian. He nodded lightly. "Miss Xia." There was a faint blush on Xia Mian's face. She seemed to be excited about the chance encounter, but at the same time, she was a little uneasy. She looked at Yi Liangqiu, who was sitting beside Qin Anlin. Her expression was a little subtle, but she didn't ask. The magnetic field between women was very subtle. Yi Liangqiu wasn't a fool. Naturally, she could feel that the little girl in front of her didn't like her. She raised her head and looked at Qin Anlin. "Do you need to avoid me?" "Avoid what?" "We just know each other." Qin Anlin kissed and pinched her face. But he had a bad feeling in his heart. His little Qiu seemed to be jealous. With her intelligence, she must have guessed Xia Mian's identity. But he was also curious. Xia Mian returned to B City so soon and coincidentally met him. Was it a coincidence? Xia Mian raised her hand to look at the time and smiled. "President Qin, thank you for driving me back to the hotel last night and taking me in. How about this, I'll treat you to dinner." There was more or less a touch of ambiguity in her words, which was unclear. Chapter 1404. How could she say that she wasn't jealous when her expression changed? He smiled in his heart, put his hand on Yi Liangqiu's shoulder, and said calmly, "We just met by chance, so let's forget about it." Back in Hong Kong, he did it out of respect for Mr. Du in B City. If it weren't for the fact that he wanted to establish a friendly image in front of Liangqiu, he wouldn't have even looked at Xia Mian. Of course, he also had other dark thoughts, which was to make his cute little Liangqiu jealous. Seeing her jealous expression made him feel especially good. Xia Mian was a little embarrassed after being rejected. Her face froze for a while before she said, "Miss Yi can come with us." Qin Anlin put his arm around Yi Liangqiu's neck. "She's not Miss Yi, she's my wife." Xia Mian forced a smile. "Mrs. Qin, nice to meet you." Yi Liangqiu just smiled faintly, not very friendly. She didn't need to be nice to a woman who had ulterior motives towards her man. Xia Mian was a little embarrassed, so she turned around to find the book she wanted. Yi Liangqiu noticed that the book she picked was called An Actor's Self-Cultivation. She smiled and stood up with Qin Anlin's arm. "I'm going to the bathroom." Qin Anlin nodded and patted the back of her hand. "We'll go eat when you come back." There was a hint of mockery in her eyes, and Qin Anlin immediately understood. He patted her butt. "Naughty." Only then did Yi Liangqiu walk to the bathroom. She stood in front of the sink and slowly scrubbed her hands. She was thinking about the person just now, but as she was thinking about it, that person was standing beside her. "Miss Xia." Yi Liangqiu smiled faintly. Xia Mian also called out, "Miss Yi, I know you." Yi Liangqiu heard the way Xia Mian called her, so she could naturally feel the sharpness in Xia Mian's voice. She smiled carelessly. "Didn't Anlin introduce me to you just now?" Xia Mian raised her chin slightly. "No. The Miss Yi I know is an actress, and I will be an actress like you in the future." Yi Liangqiu calmly continues to wash her hands and chuckles, Miss Ya, I want you to stand beside me and talk to me now, not because I am an actress, but because I am Qin Anlan's wife, right? Xia Mian's voice was low. But he's not married to you yet. There are plenty of people who want to replace him. Do you think he's still single in his 30s because he's waiting for you to appear? Yi Liangqiu smiled. Do you know how many trainees King Entertainment has every year? It's not like there aren't any who are younger and better looking than you. Didn't Miss Yi climb into President Qin's bed like this? Xia Mian's tone was a little stubborn and aggressive. Yi Liangqiu chuckled. So that's how it is. How about this, I'll ask Anlan for you and ask him if he's willing. Is that okay, Miss Ya? She was polite, gentle, and not aggressive at all. But Xia Mian was beaten to the point of retreat. No matter how you looked at it, her current situation and role were immoral. Yi Liangqiu stood on the moral high ground. Xia Mian pursed her lips and finally left. Looking at the direction in which she left, Yi Liangqiu was in a daze. With Qin Anlan's wealth, status, and appearance, girls like Xia Mian would continue to throw themselves at him in the future. It was impossible to stop them. It mainly depended on what Qin Anlan thought. She wasn't afraid. She had lost many things, so she wasn't afraid of losing. Chapter 1405. When she walked out and saw him, she couldn't help but feel a little annoyed. In a corner where there was no one around, she leaned on his shoulder and bit him hard. Are you a puppy? He let out a muffled groan and pulled her little face closer to his, kissing her lips in an instant. Yi Liangqiu fiercely bit down on his lips. Even though he tasted a trace of blood, he did not let go of her and continued to kiss her. When he left her lips, he licked his lips contentedly. What lipstick did you put on today? It's quite sweet. Yi Liangqiu glared at him. Qin Anlan. All right, I know you're angry. But I promise I didn't touch a single hair on her, nor did I go to her room. Kaim can testify. He raised his finger jokingly. Yi Liangqiu couldn't be bothered with him. She picked up little Mu Yun and said, let's go for dinner. He couldn't bear to see her suffer, so he took his son and they walked out side by side. He carried his son with one hand and opened the car door for her to get in before passing his son to her. He was very careful with his movements, afraid that Mu Yun would get hurt. Yi Liangqiu could tell that he treated her and Mu Yun very well. Besides liking them, he was probably trying to make it up to them. Her heart was still a little shaken, but when she saw him getting into the car, she felt more honest than ever. This person seemed to really love her. Qin Anlan closed the car door and glanced at her. He smiled. What's wrong? Nothing, I just think that your back view is very handsome. She stuck out her tongue after saying that, disgusted by herself. Qin Anlan started the car. When he bent his arms, his muscles bulged slightly, which was very attractive. She got a little distracted as she looked at him. His shameless words came into her ears. Liangqiu, being captivated by your own husband is not a shameful thing. I think you should be loyal to your own feelings and Yuang. Mr. Qin, not yet. She reminded him. He smiled and turned the steering wheel with one hand. Soon. They would be married in half a month. As for the time being, they would still be living in the apartment. However, he was already looking for a villa garden, and it would be another half a year before he could move in. The place had been chosen, and he would bring Liangqiu there in 2 days. Qin Anlan had never longed for marriage so much. He couldn't imagine what it would be like to have a woman invade his space. But Liangqiu was different. She had long invaded his life. The first time, he had rejected her. The second time, when she was with Mu Yun, he felt that it was so natural. It was as if they were his wives, his children. Qin Anlan's heart softened, and he looked at her in the rearview mirror. Little Mu Yun was lying on Yi Liangqiu's lap. He seemed to be tired. He closed his eyes. He looked very good. At this moment, he was like a little angel. When they arrived at the intersection, he stopped the car and handed his coat to the back. Cover him. Be careful not to catch a cold. Yi Liangqiu was stunned and looked up at him. For the first time, she felt that when a man became a father, it was so sexy. She gently took it and covered little Mu Yun. Soft music flowed slowly in the car, and Qin Anlan's voice was also very gentle. Liangqiu, let's have another child, shall we? She nodded. Whether it was for Mu Yun or their marriage, she was willing to have another child. She wanted that child to grow up in fatherly and motherly love, so that little Mu Yun would have a younger brother or sister. Chapter 1406. Lin Xingyuan called a week later, which happened to be the second day after Qin Anlan came back. He went to the company, and Mu Yun was also picked up by Lady Qin. When it was almost noon, Qin Anlan called and asked his wife to send him a lunch. Usually, Qin Anlan felt a little bored during the 2-hour lunch break. Yi Liangqiu didn't believe that it was to send him a lunch. He wanted her to send him to his office. She even suspected that he had arranged for Lady Qin to pick up Mu Yun. She usually didn't care about Mr. Qin's shameless behavior and unrestrained way of doing things. He wasn't tired, but she was. As soon as she hung up, Lin Xingyuan called. Yi Liangqiu looked at the number, moved her fingers slightly, and finally picked it up. As soon as she opened her mouth, her voice was a little hoarse. Xingyuan. On the other side, Lin Xingyuan was a little bitter. Liangqiu, let's have lunch together. I'm going back to H City in the afternoon. Logically or emotionally, she couldn't refuse. Yi Liangqiu thought for a moment. Let's have lunch at the wind shelter hole. Is 12 o'clock okay? Lin Xingyuan nodded. Okay. When she put down the phone, Yi Liangqiu's heart was heavy, and she didn't come back to herself for a long time. After a long time, she smiled, looked at the time, changed her clothes, and prepared to go out. She originally wanted to report to Qin Anlan, but thinking of his vinegar bucket, she gave up. She still drove the white BMW. When she arrived at the restaurant, Lin Xingyuan was already there. At first glance, she felt that he seemed to have lost weight. Yi Liangqiu smiled slightly, walked over and sat down, and the waiter immediately poured a glass of water for her. Have you been here for a long time? She took a sip of water to hide her uneasiness. From an emotional point of view, she owed him. Lin Xingyuan smiled, holding his own cup with his fingers and turning it gently. Not long ago. He raised his eyes and said to the waiter, serve the dishes. After the waiter left, Yi Liangqiu asked softly, aren't you going to stay for a few more days? Lin Xingyuan looked at her deeply and chuckled. I didn't find a reason for myself. Yi Liangqiu looked at him, her voice a little soft. Xingyuan. Let's not talk about that. Let's have a good meal as a farewell. His tone was a little desolate. Liangqiu, love is selfish. You don't need to feel guilty. The atmosphere was a little stiff, which was what she had expected. Slowly, she removed the necklace from her neck. Xingyuan, I might not be able to accept this. Lin Xingyuan lowered his eyes and looked at it for a long time. He forced a smile and said, keep it, Liangqiu. Just treat it as a memory. Just treat it as a memory of the days we spent together. She looked at him and gently placed the necklace in his palm. Xingyuan, I hope that you can forget about it and let it go. In everyone's heart, there's an emotion that can't be erased. I met you, a very beautiful you. Xingyuan, I hope that one day you can also meet your Lin Xingyuan. At that time, don't wait for Yi Liangqiu anymore. Be with her. She felt that it was cruel to say these words, but she would rather him let it go and forget about it. It was better than being in pain all the time. She really couldn't delay him anymore. She had tried to love him, but their relationship stopped at being very close friends. Lin Xingyuan's gaze was deep. He slowly reached out his hand and put it on the back of her hand. His voice was very soft. Liangqiu, I will remember the 2 years we spent together. Chapter 1407. There was a darkness in his heart that she didn't know about. That place had long been rotten. When he looked at her, he would feel inferior because he had a motive for getting close to her from the start. How could someone like him deserve her love? When the waiter served the dishes, he drank the iced water and served the dishes to her from time to time, but he ate very little himself. He looked up and watched as Yi Liangqiu drank the water in the glass. His gaze became even deeper. Yi Liangqiu only felt that something was wrong after lunch. She looked down and felt a little sleepy as she slowly laid down on the table. Lin Xingyuan looked at her for a long time before he carried her out. Everyone looked at him and his expression was indifferent. This was the last time he would carry her. Liangqiu, you have to walk your own path from now on. My intentions towards you, my love for you, and those unspeakable darkness will all be gone with the wind. I only woke up after seeing how much you love him. Wanting to get you was just a dream. How could I deserve someone like that? In a high-end suite in a hotel, he looked down at her sleeping face. She was sleeping soundly because she had half a sleeping pill. Liangqiu, sleep. Have a good sleep. Everything will be perfect when you wake up. Those who want to deal with you, the darkness will leave you. He caressed her face with his fair fingers and smiled. Liangqiu, I liked you from the first time I saw you. She was in a deep sleep and couldn't hear a single word he said. Lin Xingyuan lowered his head and kissed her forehead. Liangqiu, I have to leave. He smiled bitterly. You said to let go and forget. But I hope that you will always remember that there was a person called Lin Xingyuan in your life. I can't hurt you, and I can't face being exposed by Su Qing. So, Liangqiu, I can only help you find happiness. He looked at her deeply for a long time before he finally got up. His phone rang and he picked it up. I'll be done soon. I'll come over to look for you later. The person on the other side laughed a few times weirdly, then asked in an even weirder voice, You didn't really touch her, did you? Of course not. Lin Xingyuan remained expressionless. Qing Qing, you are the only one in my heart. Su Qing giggled. I'm downstairs at the hotel. Lin Xingyuan put down his phone and quietly looked at Yi Liangqiu for a few seconds. In the end, he still steeled his heart and went out. The elevator went down floor by floor. He dialed Qin Anlan's cell phone. Liangqiu is in Regent Hotel room 1212. With that, he hung up the phone. This place was very close to Qin Anlan's company. After Qin Anlan arrived, the reporters that Su Qing hired would swarm over, and capture the scene of Yi Liangqiu secretly eating. This was what Su Qing wanted. And he, Lin Xingyuan, had changed the ending. When he arrived at the hotel, he did not see Su Qing. His heart tightened. He opened the car door and saw her sitting in the front passenger seat. Su Qing wore a pair of sunglasses on her small face. She looked at Lin Xingyuan and opened her palm. Where is it? Lin Xingyuan placed the phone in her hand and said calmly, I took a picture according to your request. She is not wearing any clothes right now. Su Qing calmly played with her phone and glanced at Lin Xingyuan. That means, you saw her body. Lin Xingyuan started the car and did not answer her. Chapter 1408. No. Lin Xingyuan's fingers gripped the steering wheel tightly. Su Cheng's gaze fell upon his hand. She looked at the bulging veins on his hand and saw the slight amount of sweat on it. Brother Xingyuan, tell me, what did you do? Su Cheng's voice was sweet, causing one's hair to stand on end. Lin Xingyuan narrowed his eyes and stepped on the accelerator. He said in a calm tone, if I tell you that I cut the car's brakes, Ching, will you be afraid? Su Cheng let out a long oh. So, you like her so much that you are willing to die for her and betray me? Su Cheng placed her hand on his shoulder and breathed into his ear. Back then, when you held my naked body, you said that I am the one you love the most in your life. So, Ching, let's die together. Lin Xingyuan turned his head and smiled at her. He was still gentle and elegant, still the Lin Xingyuan she knew in the past. However, she had never been able to see him clearly and understand him. Su Cheng smiled as well. Brother Xingyuan, if you want to die, I can grant you your wish. At that moment, the car had deviated from the runway and it slid down the slope of the suburbs. There was no one around. A knife appeared in Su Cheng's hand and she forcefully stabbed it into Lin Xingyuan's abdomen. Blood dyed his white shirt red and his face was pale. The scene of the car being driven at high speed, the murder within the car and his expression of fear, became like a long scene in a movie. It stretched out, and finally stopped. You want to kill me? You're not good enough. Su Cheng pushed her hand forward again, tightening her grip. Lin Xingyuan's fingers gripped the steering wheel tightly. The car had lost control and his lips curled into a dazed smile. You won't survive either. Su Cheng's foot slammed down on the brakes. After a series of pulleys, the car came to a screeching halt. Su Cheng's hand twisted madly. Brother Xingyuan, this bit of skill of yours is not enough for me, Lin Xingyuan looked at Shanine in pain, but this could not stop Su Cheng. She stabbed him again and again. Why did you betray me? Do you know that those who betray me will not have a good ending? Her hands and body were covered in blood, but she was fearless. She felt an indescribable pleasure. She killed, yes, she killed, he deserved to die. He had already said that he loved her, so why did he have to give up and love someone else? He deserved to die. Su Cheng wiped the blood off the knife and got out of the car. She used an oil bucket to fetch a bucket of oil from the car and poured it over the car. Lin Xingyuan sat there dripping with blood, not moving at all. His fingers were already hanging down. Su Cheng threw his phone into the car. She was about 5 meters away from the car and threw the lighter beside the car. The gasoline immediately ignited, and the flames soared into the sky, exploding, shattering into pieces. As for Lin Xingyuan, he had completely disappeared from this world. Qin Anlin rushed to the Regent Hotel and kicked the door open. At that time, his heart almost stopped. He walked over step by step. His Liangqiu was lying well, and there was nothing wrong with her body. He reached out to help her up and shook her awake. Liangqiu. Yi Liangqiu slowly opened her eyes. Her head was still a little dizzy, and the person in front of her also made her a little dazed. Anlin. She shook her head. I was eating with Xingyuan. Why was he here? Qin Anlin hugged her and said in a low voice, It's good that you are fine. Chapter 1409. Yi Liangqiu reached out to take it. After flipping through a few pages, her expression changed. She looked up at Qin Anlin and said, I want to call Lin Xingyuan. It was probably because she had lived with Lin Xingyuan for 2 years. She knew him very well, and his current actions made her feel a sense of farewell. She hurriedly made the call, while Qin Anlin flipped through his diary. It was written very vaguely. Most of it was about Lin Xingyuan and Yi Liangqiu's life in the past 2 years. Even when they had breakfast, it was written in detail. That kind of sweet and sour feeling with a tinge of bitterness could be felt just by looking at it. He turned to the last page, and there was only one line, "Do you know, Yi Liangqiu?" Yi Liangqiu tried desperately to call him, but she couldn't get through. She was about to cry, and her heart was cold. "Lin Xingyuan, what have you done? I won't allow you to do this." However, his phone had been turned off, and she couldn't reach him. At this moment, the door of the suite was broken in, and a large number of reporters came in. They wanted to capture the scene of Yi Liangqiu climbing the wall, but the person sitting by the bed was Qin Anlin. The scene suddenly went out of control. Qin Anlin was angry, and the reporters were excited. Yi Liangqiu desperately walked out. She wanted to find Lin Xingyuan. Her intuition told her that something had happened. However, the reporters blocked in front of her and asked frantically. Qin Anlin protected her and took her out, but there were too many reporters, and he couldn't do anything. In the end, the hotel manager came out and asked the reporters to leave. Yi Liangqiu held the diary in her hand. "Anlin, please find him." Qin Anlin held her shoulder and nodded calmly. "I will." She didn't look well, and he was worried. In the end, he called Ing Jia to take care of her. He arranged for someone to find Lin Xingyuan. There was no record of Lin Xingyuan returning to H City from the high-speed rail or the airport, which meant that he was still in the city. Qin Anlin would think that Liangqiu was overthinking if there was no reporter incident. But after the reporter incident, this matter was not so simple. Behind them, there was a hand that they could not see. Until 3:00 in the afternoon, all the mainstream media were reporting a piece of news. An Audi Q5 exploded and burned on a national highway, and there was an adult man in the car. According to the license plate number, the identity of the man was inferred to be Dr. Lin Xingyuan of H City. Yi Liangqiu sat on the sofa in the apartment. The moment she saw Lin Xingyuan, she burst into tears. Xingyuan is dead. How could that charred body belong to Lin Xingyuan? How could it be the Lin Xingyuan who bought her breakfast every day and came home early from work? He was such a good person. How could he just leave like that? She did not believe it. Qin Anlin hugged her from behind, and his voice was a little hoarse. "Liangqiu, cry if you want. Just cry it out." Her face was buried in his arm, and her voice was extremely hoarse. "It can't be Xingyuan. Qin Anlin, tell me, it can't be him. Xingyuan won't die." They had promised each other that he would find a good woman to marry. How could he die? How could he die? She cried like a child. She had lost him again. She had lost the most important person in her life. There was no way to make it up. When she fell asleep, he had gone to another world. Qin Anlin hugged her tightly, not letting her hurt herself. His face was pressed against her cold little face. It was cold and wet, and tears were everywhere. It was her heartbreak. He could understand. Chapter 14:10. Qin Anlin was startled. He hugged her properly and called her name. She was still unconscious. In the end, he still carried her and drove to the hospital. To his surprise and joy, Liangqiu was pregnant. He reached out and gently stroked her belly. This child came at the right time. It was just the right time to heal the pain in her heart. It wasn't the right time because he was afraid that she would be too sad and hurt the child and herself. Qin Anlin's heart was extremely conflicted. It was sweet and sour at the same time. He didn't know how to treat her well to make her a little happier. He asked Haim to handle Lin Xingyuan's matter. No matter what, Lin Xingyuan was an important person to Liangqiu and he had taken care of them for so many years. Kaim came over. It was a homicide. But we can't find the murderer. The killer is too cunning. He chose to burn the car and destroyed all the clues. We only know that the murder weapon was a fruit knife. Qin Anlin stood in the hospital corridor with him. He looked at Kaim for a while and took out a cigarette. Where is Lin Xingyuan? Kaim pursed his lips and sighed. He's changed beyond recognition. He's quite pitiful. Qin Anlin looked out the window with a distant gaze. There must be a story and a person behind Lin Xingyuan. What was that story and that person? Who was it? Back in the ward, he continued to watch over her and Kaim went to continue to gather information. When Yi Liangqiu woke up, it was already dark. She slowly opened her eyes and Qin Anlin immediately leaned over. Are you feeling better? Are you hungry? Mom asked Auntie Xiao to send some nourishing soup over. Yi Liangqiu felt her lips were a bit dry. She licked them and looked at Qin Anlin in front of her. She said with difficulty, Anlin, I want to find Xingyuan. She was worried about Xingyuan. But as soon as she finished speaking, she recalled the previous news and her face turned pale again. She struggled to get up but was stopped by Qin Anlin. He looked straight into her eyes, and his tone couldn't be more serious. Liangqiu, I won't stop you if you want to go crazy, and I won't be jealous either. But we have to protect our children. His large palm caressed her lower abdomen, and Yi Liangqiu was stunned. She looked at Qin Anlin for a long time before she asked with difficulty, Child? Yes. He held her in his arms and said in a very gentle voice, Yes, Liangqiu, we have another child. She hesitantly placed her fingers on her lower abdomen. She had another child so soon. His gaze slowly met his. Anlin, can you let me see Xingyuan? He hugged her, letting her feel the warmth of his body. After a long time, he finally nodded. Okay. He knew that not letting her see him would be the regret of her life. Although she was pregnant and shouldn't see these things, she was pregnant with Qin Anlin's child. His child wasn't afraid of these things. He didn't need to be afraid of Lin Xingyuan. He felt that Lin Xingyuan loved Liangqiu with his life. Then he didn't need to be afraid. He took Yi Liangqiu to that cold place, and he accompanied her. When she saw Lin Xingyuan, an extremely uncomfortable liquid rose from her stomach, and she immediately covered her mouth with her hand. She ran out and vomited so much that she almost threw up her bile, because it was too scary, too scary. Xingyuan didn't have a good ending. That scene had been entrenched in her mind, and it became her nightmare. For this, Lady Qin blamed Qin Anlin and scolded him, Liangqiu is pregnant. How could you take her to such a gloomy place? What if she got scared? Chapter 14:11. Mom, please ask the mage to help Xingyuanqiu. Yi Liangqiu hugged his arm and said softly. In the past, she didn't believe it, but now she would rather believe it. She believed that it would make Xingyuan's life better in the other world. Lady Qin was stunned and sighed, okay. I'll arrange it. She empathized with him. Like Lin Xingyuan, she used to love someone deeply. However, Liangqiu still missed Lin Xingyuan, but the person she loved was. Lady Qin shook her head and smiled softly. She smiled helplessly and sadly. The ritual was held on the 7th day after Lin Xingyuan left. On that day, Yi Liangqiu wore black and prayed for the whole morning. Qin Anlin looked at her. Although his heart ached, he could only let her be. If he didn't let her do it, she would never be at ease. At night, Qin Anlin woke up. He touched around, but there was no one beside him. He sat up and turned on the bedside lamp. Looking at the empty room, she wasn't there. He casually put on some clothes and walked to the living room. He saw her sitting on the sofa in front of the floor-to-ceiling window. She sat in the darkness of the room, looking at the night scenery outside with her lonely back. Liangqiu. His voice rang softly and he reached out to turn on a small night light. The soft light seemed to be afraid of startling her, so it surrounded her warmly. He looked at the diary on her lap. His breath stagnated, and then he felt pain. Liangqiu, are you still reading it? She looked down and didn't speak for a long time. Qin Anlin sat over and stretched out his long arms, hugging her whole body in his arms. Her face was pressed against his neck. He could feel a coldness. She was crying again. Liangqiu. He called her name with heartache and said in a low voice, "Go to sleep, okay?" Her face was pressed against his neck. After a while, she said softly, "Anlin, I feel sorry for him." Although Lin Xingyuan did not say anything, she could feel that he had died because of her. She wanted to find out the truth, but even Qin Anlin couldn't find it. Was he going to let him leave just like that? She couldn't accept this. She really couldn't. "I know you're upset, but I think Lin Xingyuan wants you to be happy." He patted her back and comforted her gently. She closed her eyes and slowly tightened her arms around his waist. Qin Anlin picked her up, carried her back to the bedroom, put her on the bed, and reached out to touch her head. "If you are not in the mood now, our wedding will be postponed for 3 months." She looked up in surprise. There were still tears in her eyes, and she looked indescribably soft. She was a little touched, because Qin Anlin was not a man who easily gave in and compromised, but he took her feelings into consideration and was willing to postpone the wedding. And this was not only his decision, he could also persuade his mother. After all, her feelings were for Lin Xingyuan. She did not refuse. Just as he said, she was not in the mood now. Even if it was a marriage, it would be rushed. Qin Anlin pinched her face, tried to take the diary away from her hand, and carefully placed it on the bedside table. He also felt a little sad. His wife was holding another man's diary all day, treating it like a treasure. He felt neglected, but as a man, he could understand her. Chapter 14:12. She was afraid of the dark. As soon as she closed her eyes, she saw Lin Xingyuan's last appearance. He had buried her face in his warm embrace and let her feel his beating heart. He had told her not to be afraid. He was here. With him around, the night had become much gentler. It was no longer as scary. Kaim hadn't found Lin Xingyuan's murderer, but he had found something else. Or rather, Kaim had brought a DNA report to Qin Anlin. He only flipped it open for 2 seconds before closing it. He looked at Kaim and said sternly, "Have you read it?" Kaim asked cautiously, "Not yet." "What's wrong, President Qin?" "Nothing. You can leave first." Qin Anlin's tense tone eased. Kaim nodded and walked out. When he reached the door, he suddenly turned around and said, "I didn't find this document. It was sent to the company." Qin Anlin looked up. Kaim's heart trembled and he hurriedly left. He had followed Qin Anlin for a long time, so he more or less understood Qin Anlin. Just looking at his gaze was enough to make him tremble. The door closed and Qin Anlin's gaze fell on the document. After a long time, he covered his eyes with his hand and let out a long sigh before falling back into the chair. Liangqiu was actually Su Shiqing's daughter. He covered his eyes with his hand and didn't have the strength to get up for a long time because all the strength in his body had been sucked away by this reality. He didn't care too much, but his mother wouldn't not care if she knew what Su Shiqing had done to the Qin family. Liangqiu was the missing Susu, the girl he had played with since he was young. He remembered that Susu had the purest eyes in the world. When he was 10 years old, he had wondered what she would look like when she grew up. Now he knew that she would look like Liangqiu. Qin Anlin wiped his face with his hand and let out a long sigh. Whether it was Liangqiu or Susu, she was the mother of his 2 children and the person he had fallen in love with. He picked up the document and looked at the address. The other party was very careful. It was impossible to find the address. He stared at it for a long time before he suddenly lit a fire and ignited the document bit by bit. The light from the fire illuminated his handsome face, making his expression look even more complicated. He had thought that she wouldn't know, but that person had sent a copy to him and Yi Liangqiu. When he returned, she was sitting on the sofa, a familiar file bag beside her. It was just that there was something extra in her folder. It was some rough information about ATV and King Entertainment. They were sworn enemies. He closed the door, looked at her somewhat stunned face, and then looked at the folder beside her. Suddenly, he felt a little angry. Liangqiu, are you wavering? She did not make a sound. His voice was tense. You want to go back to the Su family? Anlin, is this true? She looked up at him. My surname is Su. Also, did he do something outrageous to your family? Qin Anlin's lips were tightly clenched. After a while, he said calmly, yes. But Liangqiu, did you do this? Yi Liangqiu shook her head. No. So, there's no need to feel guilty. You are you, and Su Shiqing is Su Shiqing. He reached out and touched her head. Do you understand? She sat there, looking a little lost. After a long time, she said with difficulty, Lin Xinyuan's death might have something to do with my background. Chapter 14-13. Qin Anlin's eyes were locked. A moment later, he took her file, made a phone call, said a few words, and then gave the file to her. 3 days later, he got the result. The file was sent by Lin Xinyuan. How did Lin Xinyuan know about her family background, and why did he send the file regularly after she left? However, these were all mysteries after he left. Yi Liangqiu was depressed for a long time. She didn't go anywhere at home. She didn't want to go out, and she didn't want to talk, because she had a feeling, a storm was coming. Qin Anlin often accompanied her at home, and he didn't go to work if there was nothing to do. But there were always urgent matters to solve in the company, and he had to go to a meeting or 2 a week. On Monday afternoon, Qin Anlin sat by the bed, sighed, and reached out to pinch her face. Look at you. You've lost weight. Yi Liangqiu looked at him. Anlin, don't you have to work? He reached out to pinch her nose. I'm worried about you. She forced a smile and looked up at him. I'm fine. Can you bring me a manji omelette when you come back from work? I suddenly want to eat it. He was naturally happy that she wanted to eat something. He smiled and kissed her forehead again. I'll take you out for a week. She nodded obediently. He had a kind of joy that she was going to come out, so he kissed her again. I'll love you when I come back at night. He also missed her, and he also had emotional needs. He also wanted her to hug him. And this kind of emotion, which was bordering on vulnerability, only appeared after he met her. He thought it was because he really loved Liangqiu. She needed him, and he, also, needed her. After he left, Yi Liangqiu looked at the diary on the bedside table. There was a touch of pain in her eyes. Xinyuan, why did you leave? Is it because of me, because of my family background? Yi Liangqiu slowly got up. When she stood up, she felt a little dizzy. Only then did she remember that she hadn't woken up in a long time. She had been cooped up all day. Qin Anlin loved her very much. After knowing that she was Su Shiqing's daughter, he still treated her well as usual. There were a few times when she actually wanted to ask him if he really didn't care. What would he do if his mother objected? But she was too concerned about it and couldn't bring herself to ask. After drinking a glass of milk and taking a shower, she felt much better. She wanted to go out and walk around aimlessly. When she couldn't walk anymore, she flagged down a taxi. The driver looked at the rearview mirror and chuckled. "Where are you going, miss?" Yi Liangqiu said in a dress in a daze. She didn't even know that she was talking about the Su mansion. By the time she sobered up, she had already paid the fare and got off the bus. She stood at the entrance of the magnificent Su mansion. The tree in front of the door was still the same one. The familiar feeling of heartache struck him again. In her ears, she seemed to be able to hear a gentle and doting voice. Su Su. Su Su. Was that her previous name? Yi Liangqiu looked at the tree. Unconsciously, her face was already full of tears. She was carried back by Wang Kaiyun. Su Qing was the child of the Yi family. And Su Qing killed Yi Sun and her own brother. Her body was cold. She didn't want to be in it, but it was already there. Today, she received a phone call. The caller ID was a strange number, and the voice was changing. Thinking of that voice, she felt a little creepy. Chapter 14:14. Anlin. Lin Xingyuan, what did that lunatic want? She looked up at the tree, her eyes blurred with tears. At that moment she had never felt so weak, so helpless. Lin Xingyuan had already left. She couldn't lose Anlin. Was the person who killed Lin Xingyuan Su Shiqing? Was it because Lin Xingyuan found out about her past, so he was silenced? Why didn't Su Shiqing object to her marrying Qin Anlin? Was it because he wanted to swallow up King Entertainment? Yi Liangqiu's body was a little cold. She looked up at the huge mansion. She didn't feel the slightest bit of warmth. Instead, she felt an indescribable pain. Behind her, she heard the sound of a car stopping. She slowly turned around. The door opened and Mrs. Su and her daughter got out of the black limousine. Su Cheng was wearing a light yellow dress. She leaned against Mrs. Su, looking lovely and lovely. Mrs. Su patted Su Cheng's hand lovingly. "Look at you. You want me to come down. He has already snatched Anlin Gu from you. What else do you want to see?" Su Ching hugged Mrs. Su's arm and leaned her head on Mrs. Su's shoulder. She looked like a little girl. She was talking to Mrs. Su, but she looked at Yi Liangqiu with a provocative gaze. "Mom, I was just curious when I saw her standing here alone. Why did she come to our house?" Su Ching chuckled. Then, she stood up and walked straight to Yi Liangqiu. "Sister Liangqiu, if you want me to bless you in Anlin Gu, then I'll bless you. Are you satisfied?" Su Cheng's eyes were filled with an evil smile. When she turned around, she looked obedient. "Mom, let's go in. Dad is waiting for us." Mrs. Su looked at her daughter and then at Yi Liangqiu. She frowned. Ching, why are you talking nonsense with her? Your mom has seen many women like her." Every word was like a blade cutting into Yi Liangqiu's heart. This person was her mother. However, as she stood in front of her, she could only see disgust and contempt in her eyes. In her heart, there was only Su Ching. At this moment, Yi Liangqiu understood that what really separated her from her family was not Wang Kaiyun, but the human heart and time. No one could outlast time, not even kinship. Mrs. Su had already treated Su Ching as her own daughter. What was the point of her saying that she was Su Su? She didn't say anything, but her eyes were full of pain. Mrs. Su's heart was even more disgusted. She smiled coldly and said, "Miss Yi, life is not an act. You can't just stand in front of our house pitifully. You can leave now. She waved her hand as if she were waving away a fly. Yi Liangqiu lowered her eyes. In terms of acting skills, I'm far inferior to Su Cheng. A strange look appeared in Su Cheng's eyes. From the moment Yi Liangqiu appeared here, she felt that Yi Liangqiu knew about her identity. The only possibility was that it was Lin Xingyuan. However, Yi Liangqiu must not know about her relationship with Lin Xingyuan, nor did she know that Lin Xingyuan was killed by her. Otherwise, she wouldn't be standing in front of the Su family's house with a sad face. Su Qing buried her face in Mrs. Su's arms. Mom, Sister Liangqiu must be holding a grudge against Yi Sun, so she deliberately took away Anlan Gu and came here to anger me. Chapter 14-15. Yi Liangqiu felt a chill in her heart. She looked at Su Qing. Did she really not know that Yi Sun was her brother? Or did she do it on purpose? Mrs. Su looked at the girl in front of her. The look in her eyes made her very uncomfortable. Mrs. Su loved Su Qing very much. Coupled with the recent injustice in World City, Su Cheng had suffered a lot. She was so angry that she slapped Yi Liangqiu. This slap was extremely ruthless. It was followed by Mrs. Su's protective voice. I'm telling you, if you dare to hurt my Qing Qing, I won't let you go. Yi Liangqiu took a step back, her face as white as paper. Her lower abdomen was a little painful, very painful. Her pure white skirt was stained with a streak of bright red. It was a frightening sight. Su Cheng was stunned. Mrs. Su, how could she get blood from one slap? Mom, she seems to be pregnant. Su Cheng's voice was trembling. Send her to the hospital. Mrs. Su was a little stubborn. How would I know she is pregnant? Besides, one slap won't cause her to miscarry. Let her go by herself and go to someone else's house to miscarry. Why, is she blaming us? Mrs. Su didn't want to pay attention to her. Su Qing pulled her back. Mom, just think of it as doing it for Dad. Think about it, it was because of Mom's slap. If we become enemies with Qin Anlan now, Dad will blame us too. Mrs. Su looked at Su Qing and sighed. Qing Qing, you are too kind. Su Qing supported Yi Liangqiu and said to the driver, Uncle Tian, come and help. The driver quickly got out of the car and looked at Mrs. Su's face. You guys send her. Qing Qing, you don't have to go either. Mrs. Su waved her hand. Su Qing said carefully, I'd better send you off, Mom. I'll be back in a bit. Mrs. Su thought for a moment, then turned around and got into the car. I'm just afraid that you'll be taken advantage of. If they blame you, just tell them that I hit them. Su Qing helped Yi Liangqiu sit in the back of the car. Her face was pale and her fingers were stained with blood. She squeezed out a smile. Thank you, Mom. She hugged Yi Liangqiu tightly and her eyes reddened. When Qin Anlan arrived at the hospital, it was already half an hour later. Mrs. Su and Su Cheng were standing at the door of the emergency room. Qin Anlan approached them step by step. Finally, he stopped in front of Su Cheng. Who hit her? He wanted to see his silly Liangqiu. He wanted to go to the Su family to see the place where she had grown up and see her biological parents. But right at the place where she grew, she almost had a miscarriage. His eyes were filled with rage, enough to burn the heavens. Su Cheng took a step back. She pursed her lips and looked at Mrs. Su cautiously. Mrs. Su was about to speak when Su Cheng closed her eyes and shouted, I slapped her. Qin Anlan's eyes stared at her. He stared at this willful girl who he had watched grow up. Her willfulness had caused Yi Sun to jump off a building. He clearly knew that Liangqiu wanted revenge. But many times, when he thought of how cute Su Cheng was when she was young, he did not get too involved. But now, her willfulness was directed at Liangqiu. Qin Anlin waved his hand and Su Cheng's face was slapped to the side. On her fair and delicate face, not only was there a palm print, but there were also traces of blood. Soon, it swelled up like a steamed bun. Chapter 14-16. Mrs. Su was shocked and immediately came over to support Su Cheng. Cheng, how are you? Are you okay? How could this silly child be so silly? She was the one who hit her, so why did Cheng take the blame? Su Cheng grabbed Mrs. Su's hand and shook her head. Her face was pale. Mom, I'm fine. Anlin Gu was right to slap me. I shouldn't have hit Yi Liangqiu. Mrs. Su shook her head. It's not like that. Cheng, why are you so silly? She wanted to say it, but Su Cheng did not let her. She stopped her with a stern voice. Mom. Mrs. Su was shocked. She looked at her daughter in a daze, unable to say a word. However, her heart was in a mess. Although Cheng was not her biological daughter, she was better than her own. Qin Anlin smoked a cigarette. He leaned against the wall and blew out a ring of smoke, looking up. He did not dare to think about what would happen to Liangqiu if they lost the child. He knew that he was being selfish. He had never seen her like this. Even when he abandoned her, she did not act like this. He did not approve of her revealing her identity. Once it was revealed, they would face many obstacles. The competition between the two companies, the grudge between Su Shicheng and the Qin family, and his mother. Even if he did not say it, she knew it in her heart. So, she tried her best to suppress it. Qin Anlin extinguished the cigarette with his bare hand. The sparks were extinguished in his palm. His palm hurt, but not as much as the pain in his heart. He raised his head and looked at the white wall above him, waiting in a state where death was better than life. An hour passed and the emergency room door finally opened. The doctor in charge of the emergency room was Dr. Mei, the best gynecologist in Xingyuan Hospital. She took off her mask and looked at Qin Anlin. This child is very strong. It will be fine. After one night of observation, she will be discharged tomorrow. Seeing his dumbfounded face, Dr. Mei smiled. Mrs. Qin's constitution is very special, so bleeding is not fatal. However, if something like this happens in the future, you must come to the hospital immediately. Also, pay attention to the pregnant woman's emotions. The most important thing during pregnancy is to be in a good mood. Qin Anlin was still in a daze and nodded instinctively. Dr. Mei smiled again. Sigh, this was what being a father was like. In the past, Qin Anlin was like a tyrant, but now, he looked like a fool. His voice unconsciously softened. Take a look at her later and comfort her. What a pregnant woman needs the most is her husband's care. Qin Anlin's heart seemed to be filled with gentle water. He said in a hoarse voice, I know. When Yi Liangqiu came out, her face and long hair were drenched in sweat, as if she had just gone through a life-and-death battle. He couldn't help but bend down and press his face against hers. He warmly called out, Liangqiu. She was still awake. She slowly opened her eyes and looked at him. Her lips moved slightly, but she did not have the strength to say anything. The child is still here. He kissed the sweat on her forehead and comforted her softly. A tear slid down the corner of her eye, and the corners of her mouth lifted slightly. He knew that she was happy. I'm sorry. Her lips tried to move, but she could not make a sound. Qin Anlin hugged her. Don't say sorry. Liangqiu, as long as you are well. They were hugging each other passionately, but the nurse could not stand it. Chapter 14-17. Qin Anlan's face was a little embarrassed. Yi Liangqiu's lips curled up again, and the tears in the corner of her eyes slid down again. At this moment, what he did not know was that in her heart, her only family was him and Mu Yun. Today, she lost her blood kin again. Listening to Mrs. Su's words, she knew that blood kin was not that important to Mrs. Su. The one who was raised by her side was the closest. But why did Wang Kaiyun not love her even a little bit after raising her up? Yi Liangqiu's fingers moved. She did not know where she got the strength from, but she grabbed Qin Anlan's hand. At this moment, she felt as if she had promised to spend the rest of her life with him. She looked up, and big tears fell down her cheeks. He felt sorry for her and kissed her away. The nurse looked at them helplessly. Damn it, did they think they were acting in a romantic drama? Well, if she looked carefully, the male and female leads were really good-looking. In the end, Yi Liangqiu and Qin Anlan were pushed into the ward together. The door was closed, leaving Su Cheng and Mrs. Su outside. Mrs. Su looked at them and sighed. I did not expect Qin Anlan to be such an infatuated person. When true love comes, it can't be stopped. She glanced at Su Cheng, who was in a daze. Let it go. Qin Anlan is not your man. Su Cheng just said in a daze, she really fell in love with him. But what Mrs. Su heard was, he really fell in love with her. She only knew that Su Cheng was sad at that time, so she said a few words and dragged her out of the hospital. Sitting in the car, Su Cheng was still in a daze until they reached home. Su Shicheng was already home, sitting on the sofa reading the newspaper. Seeing the mother and daughter coming back, he folded the newspaper and smiled. Where did you go shopping? You came back so late. Mrs. Su patted her chest. Shicheng, look at Ching Chang's face. I'm so angry. Mrs. Su said and went upstairs to get the medicine. She was going to wipe the medicine on Su Chang's face. It would be ugly if there was a scar on her face. Mr. Su looked at his wife's back, and his eyes were a little deep. After a while, he got up, walked in front of Su Cheng, and touched her wound with his hand. What happened? Su Cheng didn't act coquettishly in front of Mr. Su. She pursed her lips and said, Anlan Gu did it. She knew that she couldn't hide it from Su Shicheng, so she just said it directly. Su Shicheng looked at her face for a long time. How did he hit you? Didn't your mother protect you? His tone was so calm that it made Su Cheng feel a little scared. She clearly knew that to Su Shicheng, she was just a spare tire, a tool. He had found his biological daughter. As a spare tire, she was useless to him. She really didn't know what he would do to her. Only she knew how ruthless Su Shicheng was. Su Cheng didn't speak for a long time because she was stalling for time, waiting for Mrs. Su to come down. Although Mrs. Su wasn't Su Shicheng's favorite in his heart, he still had some feelings for her after so many years. Besides, Mrs. Su's family was very famous in the political world, which was why Mr. Su had always treated her well. Sure enough, after she got through that difficult minute, Mrs. Su went downstairs. Seeing Mr. Su looking at Su Cheng, Mrs. Su's face was a little unhappy. Shicheng, why are you scaring her? She was scared by Qin Anlan today. Mrs. Su ran over and obediently pulled Su Cheng to the sofa to apply medicine on her. Her tone was still reproachful. I was the one who hit her. If you feel that it's hard to explain, you can talk to Qin Anlan. Chapter 14-18. Mr. Su's expression was a bit complicated. He looked at his wife and asked after a long time, did you hit her? Mrs. Su nodded, yes, I hit her. Is there a problem? Su Shiqing's pupils contracted sharply, and after a long time, he said softly, "Why did you hit her?" "For a seductive actress like her, I hit her whenever I want. Besides, she bullied our Ching Ching," Mrs. Su said casually. She didn't think there was anything wrong with hitting an irrelevant person. "Oh, by the way, she is really useless. She almost had a miscarriage after hitting her." The veins on Su Shiqing's forehead were bulging. He stared at his wife. "Are you so indifferent to a little life?" He couldn't accept that she almost killed her own daughter. Mrs. Su glanced at him and thought that he was crazy. At this time, Su Qing whispered, "Mom, if she really had a miscarriage, it wouldn't be good to have two lives." Mrs. Su threw down the medicine in her hand. "Nonsense." She hardened her heart. "Even if we die together, the Yi family is crazy. It's better to die peacefully." After saying that, she was slapped by Su Shiqing on the face. It was a hard slap. Mrs. Su was stunned. Su Shiqing hit her. She looked at him in disbelief. "You hit me?" Su Shiqing came to his senses at this time. He didn't know why he was so irrational just now. He let out a long sigh. "Think about it, if we really died, would Qin Anlin let us go?" Mrs. Su was a spoiled child. How could she stand this? Even if Mr. Su softened, she would never let him go. Therefore, she disregarded her dignity and started to fight in front of Su Qing. Su Shiqing also suffered a lot, but in the end, he endured it and fought back a few times. Mrs. Su's cries were earth-shattering. The two of them became a mess. And Su Qing slowly went upstairs. She sat on her balcony, listening to the sound of breaking downstairs. She smiled coldly. Loving couple. She only provoked them a little, and they turned against each other. That stupid woman, how could she say that she was dead? Was that slap really that easy to slap? Yi Liangqiu was fine. If she was, she would definitely take good care of Mrs. Su. This stupid woman, did she think that her motherly love could move her? Dream on. Living in the Su family was a kind of humiliation in itself. She couldn't forget how Madame Su had looked at her with a fearful gaze when she had just arrived here. Madame Su said that she was a jinx and that if she left, her Su would return. After so many years of companionship, she knew that she had recovered, but this was just a facade. As long as one was alive, one would become a fool if one were to develop true feelings. Only by playing others in the palm of one's hand could one live a good life. Su Qing chuckled softly, and it was a particularly happy smile. "Fight, fight, fight, it's so lively. It's been a long time since the house was so lively." She laughed softly and laughed until tears came out of her eyes. She couldn't see the light of day. She thought that she was invulnerable. But today, she still felt heartache. Looking at them hugging each other, it was so touching. Su Qing took out a stack of photos from the drawer, took one out, and pinned it firmly on the wall. That photo was of Qin Anlin. She stepped back, raised her hand, and shot a dart straight at Qin Anlin's face. Chapter 14:19. Downstairs, Mr. Su's face looked like it had been scratched by a stray cat. He gasped and looked at Mrs. Su. "Are you crazy?" Mrs. Su was not one to be trifled with. She sneered. "You're the crazy one. You actually hit me for a woman who has nothing to do with you." In fact, Mr. Su had touched Mrs. Su's nerve. 10 years ago, something happened between Mr. Su and a female star from ATV. He thought she didn't know, but she saw it clearly. Later, she used her family's power to quietly get rid of that woman. Su Shiqing knew about this, but neither of them exposed it, which was considered giving each other face. Now, she was worried that Yi Liangqiu would be the next. Su Shiqing was a very indifferent person. He actually hit her for Yi Liangqiu. Mrs. Su sneered. Su Shiqing, do you like that bitch? I know she is young and beautiful, but don't forget, she has Qin Anlan seed in her stomach. You really have a heavy taste. I feel disgusted and embarrassed for you. Su Shiqing's breathing was rapid. He angrily threw a table lamp at her and roared, do you know what you're talking about? She is. The table lamp hit Mrs. Su's forehead. Blood slowly flowed down, dark red and shocking. Mr. Su was stunned. So was Mrs. Su. Her fingers gently stroked her forehead. For a long time, she looked in Su Shiqing's direction. Her lips moved, but she didn't say a word. At this time, Su Cheng stood on the stairs and screamed, Mom. She almost crawled over and hugged Mrs. Su. She cried, Mom, Mom. I'll take you to the hospital. Mrs. Su let Su Cheng hug her. She was in a daze. After a while, she said softly, Ching Ching, there is no place for us in this family. Your dad dislikes us. Mom will take you away. Su Cheng cried and hugged her. Mom. I don't want you to go. I don't want you to be separated from Dad. Then he knelt down in front of Su Shiqing. Dad, I beg you. Mom didn't hit Yi Liangqiu on purpose. She just felt sorry for me. It's all my fault. If Dad wants to blame someone, blame me. It has nothing to do with Mom. Really, it has nothing to do with Mom. Her face was covered in tears. In the end, she moved her knees over and hugged Su Shiqing's arm. Dad, I beg you. Mom can't live without you. Su Shiqing was originally furious. This time, Mrs. Su had challenged his bottom line. But now that Su Cheng was crying and pleading, he didn't care about Su Cheng and listened to her last sentence. Yes. They had been married for so many years. Where could she go if she followed him? Although her maiden family was strong, her brother and sister-in-law were already in charge. How could a daughter who ran back have a foothold? Mr. Su sighed and walked over to gently support Mrs. Su. Okay, don't cry. I'll take you to bandage your wound and go to the hospital for an examination. Don't break your head. Mrs. Su let out a long cry. Su, I hate you to death. The blood from her head flowed all over her face and into her mouth. She looked like a zombie coming back to life. It was really scary. Mr. Su frowned. He really couldn't bear to do it. Facing such a living thing, which man could say sweet words? Chapter 1420. Women can't be coaxed. This sentence was proven right now. As soon as he coaxed her, Mrs. Su became excited. She pounded on Mr. Su with all her might, calling him a cheap man and saying all kinds of nasty things. Mr. Su could only coax her. One side hit, the other side dodged. Meanwhile, Su Cheng had already gotten up from the ground. She went to the dining room to wash her hands and enjoy the meal. There was a hint of coldness in her eyes and a mocking smile on her lips. It was a lively fight. Mrs. Su noticed that Su Cheng wasn't there. She turned around and saw her eating. Su Cheng smiled sweetly at them. Dad, Mom, let's continue. This damn child. Mrs. Su's face turned red. In fact, her face was full of blood. It was red to begin with, and scolded. Su Shiqing had never been so embarrassed before. He glared at Mrs. Su. How much longer do you want to let the child see this joke? The two of them always had some dignity. At this time, they calmed down and went upstairs to change clothes and wash. After a while, they looked like a loving couple again and didn't mention what happened just now. However, Mrs. Su obviously loved Su Cheng more. It should be known that Su Cheng's performance just now deeply touched Mrs. Su's heart. She felt that Su Cheng was her own daughter. The Su family slept for 2 nights. Mrs. Su touched the wound on her forehead. After a while, she looked up at Su Shicheng. I want to give my shares to Ching Ching. Su Shicheng stared at Mrs. Su and immediately sat up. Are you crazy? Mrs. Su's anger rose again. What are you saying? She saw that Su Shicheng didn't soften, so she softened her tone. Su can't be found. We still have to rely on Ching Ching in the future. ATV still has to be inherited by her. Su Shicheng didn't say the words that came to his mouth. He just said solemnly, this is not urgent. Let's wait and see. Mrs. Su had never participated in the management of ATV. However, when the company was established, Mrs. Su used her dowry to invest tens of millions. She had 20% of the original shares. The 80% in Su Shicheng's hands was diluted to only 30%. The couple together had a 50% chance of sitting in the chairman's position. This was also one of the reasons why Su Shicheng was interested in Mrs. Su. Now that Mrs. Su mentioned it, Su Shicheng knew that if he strongly opposed it, Mrs. Su would go against him. Now was not the time to talk about Yi Liangqiu's background. If she told the truth, her marriage with Qin Anlin would probably fall through. In his heart, he suspected that Liangqiu and Qin Anlin knew something. That was why she came to the Su family's house. Su Shicheng was a traditional man. Although Yi Liangqiu was a girl, she was still his child. And Su Cheng was the child of that crazy Wang Kaiyun. No matter how well-behaved she was, no matter how obedient she would at most be raised by the Su family. He would never hand over everything in the Su family to her. He knew his wife too well. She was soft-hearted. If everyone did big things like her, ATV would have changed owners long ago. King Entertainment was also keeping an eye on ATV. At this time, if the 20% fell into Su Cheng's hands, the consequences wouldn't be that fun. I have my own plans for this matter in the future, Mr. Su warned. Chapter 1421. Xingyuan Hospital. Qin Anlin had been accompanying Yi Liangqiu the entire time. Hence, when she woke up, the first person she saw was Qin Anlin. She opened her eyes as tears flowed down. Qin Anlin kissed away her tears and caressed her pale face. Liangqiu, I know. I know. He kissed her repeatedly to soothe her emotions. She shut her eyes tightly as her mind was filled with Mrs. Su's words. When she was young, she was carried in her mother's embrace. Su, Mummy loves you the most. Su, grow up quickly. Mummy will bring you out to play. Su, where are you? Why can't Mummy find you? Without you, Mummy can't live on. Her mother's tears dripped down before her as her mouth was covered. She looked at her mother breaking down in tears. She wanted her mother to stop crying and call out to her, but she couldn't. She was carried away just like that. Shi Guang had soothed her mother's heartache as she gave all her gentleness to Su Cheng. In her mother's eyes, she was a bitch. Yi Liangqiu stretched out her arm and bit it as she cried out. Qin Anlin looked at her with a pained expression as he stretched out his arm and said with a deep voice, "Bite me if you want." He felt sad for her. He knew that he was being selfish. He could have brought her to the Su family. Anlin, you're the only one I have left. She hugged him as her body trembled. Lying in his arms, she could only think of that terrifying voice. Who was that person? The person she was most suspicious of and unwilling to believe was Su Shicheng. No, it wasn't Su Shicheng. Su Shicheng's plan was to marry her off to Anlin, not him. That person definitely had something to do with Xing Yuan's death. She laid in his embrace softly. Anlin, I'm so close to you, but I'm afraid. I'm afraid of losing you. An hour later, Lady Qin came over. She knew that Su Qing had hit someone and wanted to head over to teach her a lesson. Mom, I've already called back, Qin Anlin said calmly. However, Lady Qin and Yi Liangqiu were stunned as well. Qin Anlin hit Su Qing. Hit a woman. However, Lady Qin snapped back to her senses quickly. Well done. She's becoming more and more arrogant. She even dares to lay her hands on our Qin family. Fortunately, you didn't want to marry her at that time. Otherwise, our family would be in trouble. Qin Anlin looked at his mother helplessly. Was this a professional conman? Su Qing Sang Guang Anlin covered her and smiled. This old lady's Qin Guang's attitude. She clasped her hands together. It's great that the child in young madam's belly is fine. It's Hua family. Qin Su Hua. Madame Qin also laughed coldly. That year, Su Shiqing used a slut to break up our Qin family. I will definitely settle this debt with him. Qin Anlin's heart skipped a beat. He didn't expect his mother to also know about this. He couldn't let Liangqiu and the Su family acknowledge each other. The body in his arms was also trembling slightly as she looked up at him. Her expression was one of helplessness. She couldn't acknowledge her parents, nor could she tell Mrs. Qin about her past. She was caught in the middle and had too many secrets that she couldn't tell anyone. Yi Liangqiu lay on Qin Anlin's shoulder. Anlin, I want to go home. Lady Qin objected. The doctor said you can only go home tomorrow. Lie down. I'll ask Anlin to watch over you. Don't worry as long as Mu Yun is with me. No matter what, you have to do it for yourself and for the child in your belly. Yi Liangqiu was about to cry when she heard that. She felt the mother she hadn't seen in a long time. Chapter 14:22. But in the end, she still didn't hug him because she didn't have the courage. Lady Qin left, and Qin Anlin helped her lie down. His fingers gently stroked her forehead. I'll get a towel to help you wipe your sweat. Her body was very weak at the moment, and she would sweat in a short while. Yi Liangqiu nodded and watched him walk into the bathroom. He was very calm, and his movements were gentle, which made her feel like she was being cared for. This was Qin Anlin, the Qin Anlin who had once disappointed her. But now, she could really feel that he loved her, Anlin. Her fingers grabbed his hand, and she looked at him weakly. Can you lie down with me? Qin Anlin smiled, put down the towel in his hand, and slowly lay down beside her. He turned sideways and carefully circled her in his arms with one hand. Their eyes met, and his voice was incredibly gentle. What do you want to talk about? She was still very weak. Lying in his arms, she smelled the good smell of his body. Nothing. I just want to feel your temperature. She buried her face in the crook of his arm and felt like crying again. He knew how sad she was. In addition to the fact that her parents couldn't recognize each other, she must have felt guilty in her heart. She felt that her birth was unfair to her mother. He lowered his head, and his voice was a little hoarse. Liangqiu, it's not your fault. But I'm afraid. She buried herself in his arms, and her voice was low. I'm afraid that that day will come, except for Mrs. Su and Lady Qin. Su Shiqing definitely knew about her background. Then, there would be a day when it would be exposed. Qin Anlin lowered his head and kissed her lips lightly. Liangqiu, even if that day comes, you still have me. She looked up at him for a long time, and finally rested her head on his shoulder. Her hands gently hugged his waist. Anlin, I feel like I've never loved you so much. His voice was low. Me too. Will we be together forever? She raised her head and looked at his handsome chin. He smiled. Of course I will. When we are too old to walk, I will still be your Anlin. Do you believe in love? Yes, my love is called Liangqiu. He patiently chatted with her until she fell asleep from exhaustion. When she fell asleep, Qin Anlin held her hand and didn't dare to move for fear of waking her up. He didn't know what Liangqiu was thinking. There was some uneasiness in his heart, or perhaps it was a premonition. The next day, Dr. May said that she could be discharged. Qin Anlin took her back to the apartment and brought Muyun back. Lady Qin didn't agree at first because she was afraid that Liangqiu would be too tired. How could she take care of a child when she was bedridden? In the end, Qin Anlin took care of the child himself, so Lady Qin didn't have much to say. After a few days, Liangqiu's body was much better, but she seemed to be a little clingy. In the past, Liangqiu was cold and aloof. She never said sweet words, and it was difficult to hear nice words from her. But now, she was really different. She stuck to him in all kinds of ways. Even when he was cooking, she lay behind him. As a carnivore, Qin Anlin couldn't stand it anymore. He turned around, held her face, and kissed her. His voice was low and husky. Baby, if you go on like this, I won't be able to stand it. She tiptoed and received his kiss. Her voice was warm. Then don't hold it in. Chapter 14:23. After kissing her fiercely, he let out a long breath. Little jerk. You know that I don't dare to. No matter how much he wanted to, he had to consider the child in her belly. At this moment, his palm landed on her flat abdomen. His voice was a little hoarse. Be good, listen to me. When the child is born, I'll take good care of you. She leaned on his shoulder and bit his neck. Her voice was muffled, but it was extremely tempting. You can do it in 3 months, this little vixen. She was deliberately making it hard for him. He reached out and slapped her little butt. His voice was unbelievably hoarse. Don't seduce me anymore. She hugged him tightly and pressed her face into his neck. She was very dependent on him. She was so soft that it melted his heart. He never knew that she could be so soft. It was probably because she was pregnant. He reached out to hug her and rubbed his face against hers. All right, baby. If you continue like this, the rice will be burnt. But she said coquettishly, then burn it again. Qin Anlin looked at her helplessly and smiled. You've become a child all of a sudden. She refused to come down. She hugged him with all her might, just like a child. Qin Anlin was extremely helpless. At night, after coaxing Mu Yun to sleep, she lay like a long little frog with her belly facing the sky. The bathrobe fell apart hopelessly. He propped himself up and kissed her carefully to satisfy his wife's fantasies. Qin Anlin smiled bitterly. He was full of anger now and had nowhere to vent it, but he had to kiss his wife gently. Looking up at her intoxicated look, his heart softened again. All the forbearance had become unimportant. After a month, she looked much better and her mood seemed to have calmed down. When Qin Anlin went to work, she and little Mu Yun sat on the sofa watching TV. Little Mu Yun had been fascinated by a series of cartoons recently. When he was changing the channel, he happened to see a set of news. At 1:30 in the afternoon, the head of King Entertainment was rear-ended on the road. A large part of the back of the car was knocked off. Qin Anlin had been sent to the hospital for emergency treatment. 1:30. Liangqiu was stunned. She remembered that at 2 o'clock, he called her several times and told her easily that he would be back late tonight. While she was in a daze, little Mu-yun asked softly, "Did Daddy hurt himself?" Yi Liangqiu pursed her lips. "Dad is fine. Didn't he call me just now?" Little Mu-yun let out a soft hum, but he still looked at her eagerly. He was a very sensitive child. Yi Liangqiu and little Mu-yun looked at each other for a while before she said softly, "Then Mommy will take you to Daddy, okay?" Little Mu-yun immediately nodded. After that, he didn't want his mother to hug him and chose to hold his mother's hand instead. She was a little flustered when she drove there. She told herself countless times not to panic. Not only did she have Anlin, but she was also the mother of 2 children. When they arrived at Xingyuan, Kaim was already waiting in the underground parking lot. She opened the car door and carried little Mu-yun. She hesitated whether she should help President Qin's wife, but when she saw that Yi Liangqiu was in good condition, she gave up the idea. "President Qin is waiting for you upstairs," Kaim said immediately. "It's just a slight concussion. He'll be fine after 2 days of observation." Chapter 1424. Fortunately, it's Xingyuan Hospital. Otherwise, the entrance of the hospital would have been flattened by these reporters. Kaim walked into the elevator. That's how celebrities are. Small things are magnified countless times. There's no privacy at all. Yi Liangqiu looked at the mirror and said calmly, "Kaim, do you think this is a normal traffic accident?" Kaim looked at Yi Liangqiu awkwardly. After a while, he said, "The results aren't out yet, but the driver has been detained in the police station. There will be a conclusion soon." Yi Liangqiu's gaze fell on his face for a long time. Kaim's Adam's apple bobbed as if it was extremely difficult to speak. Kaim squeezed out a smile. "Let's take a look at President Qin first. President Qin heard that you were coming. He was happy but worried." As he said this, he added, "I've never seen President Qin care so much about someone." Yi Liangqiu pursed her lips and didn't reply. The elevator opened and they reached the VIP ward on the top floor. King Entertainment's security guard was standing guard at the elevator. Kaim nodded and led them in. It was very quiet in the VIP ward. Qin Anlin was lying there, seemingly asleep. Kaim said softly, "The doctor told him to rest more. President Qin didn't allow me to tell you, but..." As she spoke, Qin Anlin opened his eyes and looked at Yi Liangqiu. "Why didn't you sleep more?" She walked over to the bed and sat down. She looked at him carefully to make sure that he didn't have any injuries. Qin Anlin propped himself up and smiled lazily. "How could I sleep?" She touched his forehead with her finger. "Does it hurt?" He looked at her expression and smiled. "I told you it's fine." He held her hand. "You found out about what I didn't want you to know." He looked at Kaim, who quickly said, "I didn't say it. I saw it on the news." Yi Liangqiu glanced at him. "Don't be so mean to Kaim." Kaim almost burst into tears. Finally, there was someone who cared about him. Qin Anlin glanced at him. "You're so promising. When you get back, pick a pretty girl in the company and get married. That way, there will be women who care about you every day." Kaim was stunned. Did President Qin care about him or was he jealous? After Kaim was sent away, he also took the third wheel, Yi Mu-yun, with him. Now that everyone was gone, the air became warm. "Come here, let me hug you and see if my little daughter has grown up." Qin Anlin patted the spot beside him. Yi Liangqiu sat down and pressed her face against his chest. She could feel his heart pounding, and only then did she feel that he was alive. "What's wrong?" He reached out and stroked her long hair. "Liangqiu, I'm fine. I'm fine." She did not speak but shook her head vigorously. She was so scared that she could only feel at ease by hugging him and feeling his warmth. Qin Anlin smiled and rubbed her face. You're a mother, but you're getting more and more useless. The Liangqiu he knew in the past wasn't like this, but he liked how soft she was now. The two of them leaned against each other, and their pulses and heartbeats were one. Yi Liangqiu fell asleep, and so did Qin Anlin. The two of them hugged each other, and their bodies were soaked in each other's sweat. She woke up when her phone vibrated. It was a text message. There were only a few words. This was just the beginning. The blood in her body almost froze. Chapter 14:25. Her heart was trembling. This car accident wasn't a coincidence. It was done by that person. Just the beginning. Just the beginning. If she didn't leave, then Anlin would continue to encounter such incidents. Yi Liangqiu pursed her lips and immediately deleted the message on her cell phone. Beads of perspiration rolled down her forehead, and her hands were trembling. She tried her best to control her emotions and suppress them. Looking around, she felt as though there was a pair of eyes staring at her from behind, piercing her like a sharp blade. Between her and Qin Anlin, a conspiracy was slowly approaching. Was that person after her or King Entertainment? She didn't know. She only knew that she had to find that person. Qin Anlin slept for a long time before he woke up. When he woke up, Yi Liangqiu had cooked a bowl of lily soup for him. She had added a little rock sugar in it and it felt good after he drank it. Where's Mu Yun? Qin Anlin looked out of the window. It was already dark. Yi Liangqiu covered him with the blanket. Mom came over to pick him up. He chuckled. Since when did Mom become so considerate? Yi Liangqiu looked at him and didn't say a word. He pinched her face. Why aren't you happy? Didn't you used to call me a pervert at times like this in the past? She forced a smile. I wouldn't. He looked at her for a moment. Is there something you're hiding from me? Yi Liangqiu pursed her lips and hugged his waist. No. His face was close to hers. His voice was low and gentle. Little fool. At this moment, she looked so fragile, it made him want to love her. The more he doted on her, the worse she felt. She rested her face on his shoulder, her eyes filled with sadness. Her fingers clasped his back and she pressed her face against him. Anlin, I can't lose you. Even if I have to use all my strength, I want us to live well, even if my heart is broken. She closed her eyes and kissed the corner of his mouth, igniting all his desire. Liangqiu. Qin Anlin's voice was trembling. He stroked her face with his fingers. Be good. Bear with it. I want to kiss you. She kissed his face like a puppy, and finally moved to his lips. She raised her face and stuck it to him. Her watery eyes looked into his eyes. Anlin, can you hug me? What a torturous little demon. It was simply asking for his life. Qin Anlin suddenly held her face and kissed her greedily. When he let go, he still kissed her reluctantly. He kissed her again and again, unwilling to let go. His body was so taut that it felt like it was going to explode. Liangqiu. He panted slightly. Be good. Don't move. He reached out and pulled her into his arms, hugging her tightly so that she could feel his excitement. She looked up, and her long hair was scattered. Then, she leaned forward and kissed him lightly. This time, the rhythm was completely disrupted. Qin Anlin slowly pushed her down. In the clean hospital room, her pajamas were open. He admired her beauty under the night sky. He was gentler than the night sky. She lay on the bed with her eyes closed. She heard the sound of flowers blooming and falling. The night was getting darker and the rain was starting to stop. She lay in his arms and looked up at the reflection of the moonlight on the wall. Anlin, do you believe in eternity? If you believe in eternity, will you wait for me? The moonlight was clear. She raised her fingers and stroked his handsome face. Anlin, you can blame me for being cruel. I have to do this, I have to find out. I have to find the answer. Chapter 14:26. When Qin Anlin woke up, the sky was already bright. His hand mished the pillow. Turning around, he saw that the pillow was empty. He frowned slightly and got up. Just as he was about to look for it, his gaze inadvertently fell on an envelope. He frowned and immediately opened it. Then, his expression changed. Yi Liangqiu had left. Ignoring his body, he ran out in his hospital gown. Keim stood guard at the door. President Qin. Give me the car keys. Qin Anlin's voice was fast and anxious, and he didn't stop walking. At this moment, Keim realized that he wasn't wearing shoes. He immediately ran after him. I'll drive. He couldn't figure out what was going on, but judging from President Qin's expression, something had happened. The two of them arrived at the parking lot very quickly. In the end, it was still Qin Anlin who drove. Worried, Keim sat beside him shamelessly. President Qin, what's going on? Qin Anlin pursed his lips, his fingers gripping the steering wheel tightly. Liangqiu left. And he probably knew where she had gone. Did she know what it meant when she went? It meant that they would be irreconcilable. It meant that they might not be able to be together. Keim was still a little confused. He kept looking at Qin Anlin. She is Su Qingqing's daughter. Qin Anlin's voice was very soft. After saying that, the veins on his fingers popped. Keim was stunned. Fuck, what kind of joke was this? It wasn't easy for Big Boss to fall in love with a woman, and it was the daughter of his enemy. Besides, would old Madame agree? Qin Anlin thought of how gentle she had been last night. Now that he thought about it, it was actually a farewell. His expression became even uglier. He stepped on the accelerator, the car drove straight to the entrance of the ATV. He wanted to stop her stupid behavior. After getting out of the car, he stepped into the lobby of the ATV barefoot in his hospital gown. Su Qing stood at the entrance of the elevator, leaning against it with a strange smile on her face. Anlin Gu, are you here to see Sister Liangqiu? He said nothing, brushing aside her hair roughly. You're late. Su Cheng's voice was a little lazy. She's with my dad now. My dad really loves his biological daughter. Qin Anlin suddenly turned around and looked at Su Qing. You didn't stop her. If it's fake, it's fake. How can you pass it off as genuine? Anlin Gu, I've called you Anlin Gu for so many years. Your Susu is back, but it seems like you two can't be together anymore. His fingers tightened. My dad asked her to marry you, but she refused. Su Qing sneered, look, how silly. But she's also smart. After she marries you, my dad will probably kill you and you'll be a widow. It's better to be single now. I just don't know who the child in her stomach will belong to in the end. Qin Anlin stared at Su Qing. Where is she? She's with my dad, of course. Su Qing smiled sweetly. But I'm afraid it won't be easy for her to get past my mom. After all, in my mom's eyes, she's a bitch. As soon as she said that, her fingers were folded, and she was pressed against the wall. Qin Anlin looked like a storm was brewing. I dare you to say that again. I'm telling the truth. Su Qing sneered. Qin Anlin, do you think she's that simple? Do you think someone like Yi Liangqiu would be willing to be your good wife and mother and cook for you for the rest of her life? Chapter 14:27. Qin Anlin grabbed Su Cheng's hand. His face was full of violence, and his voice was so rough that it sounded like there was hot sand in it. Get lost. Su Cheng wanted to say something, but her body had already been thrown to the side by Qin Anlin. She took 2 steps back, and her body hit the wall behind her. Her bones hurt. She wanted to stop him again, but he had already gotten on the elevator. Security. Su Cheng stomped her feet and shouted, "Where are the security guards? Go up and stop him." However, Qin Anlin's elevator had already reached the top floor. Keim was in charge of stopping the security guards. His poor little body was beaten up. Of course, his handsome face was in trouble. It was beyond recognition and swollen like a steamed bun. Su Cheng kicked him again. Keim covered his face and looked at the number of the elevator arriving. Finally, he couldn't take it anymore. His body slowly slid down, and then he smiled. At the door of the ATV president's office, Su Shicheng's secretary was guarding the door. When she saw Qin Anlin coming out of the elevator, she immediately stopped him. "President Qin, you can't go in." Qin Anlin reached out and threw the little secretary aside like he was throwing a chick. With a kick of his long legs, the heavy wooden door opened. The door slowly opened, as if in slow motion. Slowly, he saw his Liangqiu and saw her standing with Su Shicheng. His Liangqiu was dressed in white, as fresh and beautiful as the morning dew. He looked at Su Shicheng with love and warmth on his face. Was that what she wanted? Liangqiu. He didn't go in, but stood at the door. At this moment, Qin Anlin was in a sorry state he had never been in before. He was barefoot and wearing a hospital gown. He stood outside just like that, but he didn't care. He was afraid that if he was a little late, he would lose her. He could lose anything, but he could not live without her. He knew that she was not as ambitious as Su Cheng said. She was not willing to be his wife and wanted to get ATV. This was not his Liangqiu. What his Liangqiu wanted was the love that she had never received. She had to be so humble, so careful. After all these years, she was still a fool. At this moment, she looked at him in shock. He called her name, "Liangqiu, come here. Come home with me. Go home." Yi Liangqiu stood upright. She felt like she was frozen from head to toe. She had never seen him like this before. Without a care for himself, he rushed over to her and said, "Liangqiu, come home with me." She wanted so badly to go home with him, to be held by his big hand. She wanted to stand under the altar with him and accept the blessings of others together. He could be at home with her and the children. She could miss him when he was away. She had said that she didn't care if he didn't love her one day, because love was love. She wanted to love him until the day he did not love her. Then, she would put him in her heart. However, she didn't have time to tell him these things, and she didn't dare to tell him. She witnessed Lin Xingyuan leave, saw Anlin get hit by a car, and she didn't know who was behind it. She didn't dare to take the risk. She was afraid of losing him. "Anlin, I would rather stand far away and see that you are well." A faint smile appeared on the corner of her mouth, and it was an extremely desolate smile. She told herself, "Yi Liangqiu, one day, you'll return to my side." She raised her head slightly and looked at him. "Anlin, I don't want to go back." Chapter 14:28. Yi Liangqiu chuckled. She walked around the office and tilted her head. "What can you give me? 10% of King Entertainment? Or your real estate?" She chuckled. Those are all mine now, and you can't give me what I want. I don't believe in your ambition. He tried his best to calm his anger. If you were, then you wouldn't have disappeared for a few years. That's because you shelved me. Her voice became shrill. That's because I don't know that I'm Susu. I'm the heir to ATV. Her chest heaved up and down violently, and her entire body was trembling. She was the only one who knew how heartbroken she felt after saying those words. She didn't want to be like this. She didn't want to be like this, but she had no other choice. She had to stay away from him for now. Whether it was a misunderstanding or a break with him, she wanted him to live well. There was a fishy sweetness in her throat, but she swallowed it down. Qin Anlin stared blankly for a long time. He stared blankly at her almost hysterical appearance. After a long time, he chuckled softly. His voice was hoarse. Liangqiu, do you really think so? Her eyes were foggy, and she couldn't see anything clearly, but all she could do was stand straight and say coldly, yes. Are you sure that what you want is the ATV, not me, not Muyun? He looked at her, almost aggressive. Yes. I have someone else. Is that okay with you? His voice was hoarse, and there was a hint of warmth in his eyes, but his voice was stern. Think it through before you talk to me. She didn't hesitate. She looked at him and said word by word, I don't want to be someone else's accessory, Qin Anlin. I want what I deserve. She suddenly laughed. Yes, you love me, but can you give King entertainment to me? His throat seemed to be blocked. He slowly moved forward, trying to catch her. And she kept moving back until she hit the sofa. Su Shiqing wanted to say something, but in the end, he didn't say anything. Qin Anlin. We are both proud sons of heaven, so why should I bow down to others? She raised her head and her eyes were filled with tears. I don't want your mother to look at me with contempt anymore. I don't want to call her mother at all, because just thinking about everything she did to me in the past makes me sick. Yi Liangqiu. His eyes were red. Do you have a heart? He approached her step by step and pinched her chin. Is this what you really want to say? Of course. She looked at him. I have my own mother. Why should I call an old woman who looks down on me my mother? Enough. Qin Anlin's voice was tired. His voice was so low that only she could hear it. Liangqiu, can't I give you a sense of security? Her lips trembled slightly as she looked up at him. Qin Anlin's fingers fell on her lips, and his tone was gentle. I can pretend that I didn't hear what you said just now. Liangqiu, come home with me. Mu Yun is still waiting for us. His hands were on her shoulders, and there was a hint of pain in his eyes. She looked up at him, vulnerable and helpless. There was struggle and pain in her eyes. Chapter 14:29. She looked at him and chuckled. I'm a human. Not a pet. Qin Anlin, do you really think I love you? Yes, I loved you, but you trampled on my love. I came back to you from Mu Yun. He glared at her. Her face was deathly pale, but she insisted on saying, I don't want to be afraid anymore. She smiled coldly. Qin Anlin, I don't believe you'll be loyal forever. So, you'd rather control your fate in your own hands. He smiled faintly. When he looked up again, his eyes were cold. What about the child? Don't you want Mu Yun anymore? Do you want Mu Yun to have no mother, and this child who is about to be born will have no father? She choked. This is the best outcome. He pinched her chin with his fingers and stared at her coldly. I really want to see if your heart is made of iron. His strength almost crushed her chin, but she still stood straight and didn't flinch. Their eyes met, and the pain slowly turned into anger. He suddenly let go of her and put his hands down. Yi Liangqiu, if this is what you want. With that, he turned and walked towards the door. She stood there and stared at his back, unable to utter a single word. Anlin, those words of urging him to stay are a fatal wound. I'm here. Will you come back one day? The door closed and the room returned to silence. It was so quiet as if he had never been there, but he had been there, because her heart had been torn open. It hurt, it hurt. Su Shiqing cleared his throat. Liangqiu, you don't have to be so heartless to Anlin. They can still get married. Isn't it better for King Entertainment and ATV to be in-laws? Yi Liangqiu looked at this familiar yet strange man and saw ambition in his eyes. Then, when the widow gets his shares? She asked softly, Dad, do you think so? Su Shiqing became angry out of shame. Nonsense. Who said that? Yi Liangqiu looked at him. Su Qing. Su Shiqing breathed a sigh of relief. Listen to her nonsense. She used to like Anlin. Naturally, she doesn't want you to marry Anlin. I'll let your mother do the mental work. Don't worry about her. But I don't want to marry Qin Anlin. Yi Liangqiu smiled faintly. Dad, you won't force me, right? Su Shiqing laughed awkwardly. How could that be? Of course, it's up to you, but... He sighed. You're pregnant with his child. You can't give birth to a child without a father. It won't be good if word gets out. Really? She lowered her eyes. I think it's more dignified than being widowed. This child. Su Shiqing paused and asked suspiciously, You can't be thinking that I'm going to make a move on Qin Anlin, so, you came back to us. What else? She looked up and asked with a sharp gaze. If something happens to Qin Anlin, those shares won't be mine. They'll still be controlled by Lady Qin, and I'll have nothing. But it'll be different if I go back to the Su family. I can inherit ATV, and Mu Yun can inherit King Entertainment in the future. Then, won't I have everything? She chuckled. It's much easier than being widowed. Don't you think so, Dad? Chapter 1430. Su Shiqing's heart was both disappointed and gratified. He was finally back, and Liangqiu had given birth to 2 children for Qin Anlin. The Qin family was in his hands. Why would he worry about not having a chance in the future? Besides, looking at Qin Anlin, he seemed to be affectionate. How could he not give in to Liangqiu? Su Shiqing's heart had the tenderness of a father, but more of it was scheming. After thinking for a while, he said slowly, Now there is one thing that is very difficult to do. Is it the 20% in my mother's hands? Yi Liangqiu looked straight at Su Shiqing. There was not much warmth in her eyes, nor was there the slightest bit of frustration because of Qin Anlin. Su Shiqing was startled. Then, he looked at his daughter and sighed in his heart. This child was very smart, very capable, but there was something missing. Later, Su Shiqing realized that when his Susu returned to their side, she did not act like a spoiled child by their side like Su Qing, not even once. His eyes were a little deep. You also know. Of course, I know that the Su family has never relaxed their control over ATV. Liangqiu smiled softly. Dad, you are really surrounded by enemies. It is not easy. Su Shiqing's heart was touched. He pondered for a while. It is best that you are back. I will find a way to persuade your mother to transfer the 20% under her name to your name. Yi Liangqiu smiled. Okay, Dad. I will transfer it to Dad. What are you talking about? When you were a child, your mother said that she would give it to you. Su Shiqing raised his hand as if he wanted to stroke her hair, just like when Su was a child. But after hesitating for a long time, he did not touch her. It was better to kiss her when she was a child since she was raised by someone else. Su Shiqing sighed. Go inside and rest for a while. After work, I will take you home to see your mother. She also wants to see you. Yi Liangqiu nodded. She walked towards the lounge. Halfway there, she suddenly turned around and saw Su Shiqing looking at her. She smiled faintly. Dad, don't tire yourself out too much. Su Shiqing's heart softened. You've worked hard outside all these years. Dad will compensate you. Yi Liangqiu smiled faintly and didn't say anything as he walked into the lounge. But how could she fall asleep? Every time she closed her eyes, she would think of Qin Anlan's words, as you wish. All she wanted was to have a family and spend the rest of her life with the person she loved. She picked up her phone and opened it. There were many photos of Mu Yun, from when he was young to now. Mu Yun would definitely blame her, right? But she couldn't bring him along. She had to keep him by Anlan's side. That way, Anlan would not be so lonely, and he would not easily find someone else. She admitted that she had thought about it, but she wasn't sure. She didn't know how long it would take for her to do it. No one knew what would happen after such a long time. So, Mu Yun was a stone that she had placed by his side to block out Peaches. She fell asleep in a daze. At noon, she had lunch with Su Shiqing, but she didn't see Su Qing. It was not until it was time to get off work that Su Qing skipped over. As soon as she came in, Su Qing hugged Su Shiqing and affectionately called him Dad. You're tuning into the LoveLore Library YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.